Okay, I'm gonna have a look at the poem Digging, which is on your IOC list of Heaney poems. And I'm going to talk you through some of the main ideas in the poem, including like some of the significant devices that Heaney uses. I've already highlighted some of the phrases and words that I'm going to look at. Having said that, though, there might be some other things that I talk about, and also just so you know, I haven't highlighted these like in any particular color on purpose. I just highlighted them in different colors so you could see the distinction between the words. So, the first thing I'm going to talk about is just some of the main ideas in the poem to get you started. And actually, if you think back to these after I finish talking you through the poem itself, you might have some of your own ideas as well. But just to get you kind of started off, um, some of the main ideas in this poem, I think, or some of the kind of main themes, are to do with masculinity or gender, I guess you could say. Memory is quite an obvious one. Family, just in terms of like Heaney and how he feels about his familial relationships with his father and his grandfather. Obviously, you have some kind of contextual issues going on in terms of the Irish heritage is quite prevalent in this poem because a lot of it is about potatoes and peat. So the kind of agricultural links that you can make are quite obvious. Um, so those four things you can look at, and you might be able to explore a bit more. In terms of devices, you might want to kind of keep looking for as well. One of the main things in this poem is that there's a lot of activity going on. So there's quite a significant amount of verbs, and actually, one of the ways in which he demonstrates the shift in time is through the changing of his verbs. But we'll talk about that later. Also, you have a lot of vivid description in terms of sense imagery. So that's going to be something that you should definitely look out for. And as always with Heaney, you have quite a lot of alliteration and assonance as well throughout. But we'll have a look at those as we're going on. So, the first thing I would suggest you look at in your IOC after you've introduced this is obviously the title of the poem, which is quite significant. If you wanted to just kind of identify that in terms of language, that is a present continuous verb. So, what's the significance of that? I suppose digging, obviously, we have automatically got links to what we were talking about earlier in terms of the context, the agricultural kind of placement of the poem. Also, it's an action, so we know that this poem is going to be about like some form of action as well. And also, it links back to the ideas of masculinity that I mentioned earlier as well. Essentially, masculinity for Heaney is kind of tied up in those ideas of like physical activity. You saw it a little bit in Ancestral Photograph, and those kinds of themes come up again. How he kind of separates himself from that, though, however, is obviously because he's actually a writer. So his form of activity, which is writing, is somewhat less kind of what word am I looking for? Kind of less to do with physical activity than that of his father and his grandfather. So you could look at how he kind of I suppose separates himself from them by virtue of that, but also the fact that he kind of supposedly has so much respect for them for being able to do those difficult physical things. So, the first stanza is just two lines, so you guys should all know what that's called. It's obviously a couplet. Don't forget that the structure of this is not got any regular rhyme scheme or syllabic structure or stanzaic structure. But, as you'll see at the end of the poem, these two lines are kind of returned to at the end. Also, immediately in the poem as well, you get the idea that it's first person because he uses the possessive pronoun my twice. And he's kind of starting with an almost like zoomed in image of the pen between his fingers. And he uses a simile to refer to it as being like a gun, which is obviously another tool. This is almost like another motif of the poem. It's like the kind of tools being used throughout it. So you have the gun, you have the spade of that his father's digging with, and you have the pen as well. So a lot of the poem is about different ways in which they work. So after that kind of initial orientation, you might want to just mention here as well the phrase snug as a gun, which is obviously assonance. And it kind of shows us how comfortable he is with inhabiting that position as a writer. Then what Heaney does is he shifts from obviously the image of the pen to this idea of his father digging outside. Here in this stanza, which is a tercet, we have our first kind of indication that Heaney is going to be talking a lot about sound imagery in this poem. So we have rasping sound, the gravelly ground, we have the spade sinking, we've got lots of alliteration there. When you're looking at sound imagery and alliteration, you always need to refer to why you think it's used. So in this case, it's obviously about giving us these images of like the strongly agricultural area, and also like it gives us an idea of what's actually going on in the moment. It helps the reader to kind of imagine the sound of that digging. Here we go. His father, and what is he doing? Obviously. His father is quite a focus of a lot of his poetry, and I think it would be worth commenting on that kind of paternal relationship that he has. So like the father-son relationship, and how Heaney seems to have a lot of kind of respect and admiration for his father, especially in those poems where he's a child. And he kind of has this admiration for him in terms of his physical strength. But also, Heaney seems to have some kind of insecurities about how he's quite different from his father as well, that might be worth talking about or looking into. But I'll leave you to kind of think about that yourselves. We can tell his father is working quite hard. We have, again, I told you to look out for verbs. So we have the verb straining. Don't forget, like I said, all of these present continuous, I just keep pointing that out because there is a shift in a second. And this is where it comes in. So in the final line of this quatrain, actually that's quite neat. So you go couplet, tercet, quatrain, and then you go synchron. Oh, so you do actually have a bit of a pattern that I haven't noticed. The shift comes in here. So the final line of the quatrain, he was digging. So you have a shift to past continuous. What does that mean? It means that Heaney's now kind of flashing back. He's not talking about the present anymore. He's actually going back and thinking of the past, and he's talking about aspects of memory whereby he can remember his father working in the fields. Obviously you have that time indicator here, and just for your kind of knowledge, the potato drills, that is like jargon for the kind of rows of potatoes that he was digging. There's a lot of jargon in this actually, and in this fourth stanza here, the syncline, there's tons. So the lug, the shaft, tall tops. The lug and the shaft are just talking about different parts of the spade, and the tall tops are talking about types of potato plants. I wouldn't be put off by that type of jargon. It's very specific to farming, but at the same time, do mention it because the use of jargon obviously gives you a strong sense of context, so it's worth just kind of mentioning anyway. So don't ignore them. The coarse boot here is obviously referring to his father's boot, and the use of the adjective coarse again is quite significant because obviously it suggests that he's quite what's the word, kind of like rough around the edges, and again it's about his masculinity. So all of the language that he associates with his father is about emphasizing that physical masculinity of him and his strength. Here Heaney is referring to the spade, so we have references back to tools again, which, as we were saying, is kind of like a motif. If you guys can't remember what a motif is, it's like a recurring symbol in a text. And here, I think this is quite significant because Heaney actually involves himself in the poem here. He says that they picked, we picked. What's that? It's a third person pronoun. Okay, so you could talk about that as well, how he does actually get involved as a child.